One thing that strikes me about your work is how present you are in it.
Yeah.
Which is not what journalists are supposed to do, and it's not what scholars are trained to do. I mean, historians certainly are supposed to be invisible. We're presenting the story. It's our best take at the truth. And of course, I think increasingly over recent decades, scholars, historians among others, have been increasingly ready to cop to the fact that it's our interpretation, right? It's not God's truth, it's not just the facts, it's our selection of facts in light of some understanding we have of how the world works and how the facts fit together. There are other plausible stories. But we're telling a story that we're not in, generally, right? There's some anthropologists who insist on being in the story. Sometimes that's fun to read, sometimes you don't want to hear about them as much as you have to.
Right.
And certainly journalists, right? There's usually not an I voice unless it's, there's certain forms of journalism and they're seen as sort of marginal. And yet you're there and it's you're part of the story. You're talking about yourself, you're asking the questions, you're cruising around, talking to people, witnessing what's going on.
Well, I think I sort of attribute that to my my comics background, because when I started doing comics, I came out of this period when American cartoonists were doing autobiographical comics, normally just talking about they're breaking up with their girlfriend, they can't get a date, that kind of stuff. And I did some of that. I did some of those autobiographical comics, and so when I was going to go to the Middle East for the first time, having come out of this autobiographical comics tradition, I sort of almost automatically thought of it as, I will tell a story of my experiences in the Middle East, because I knew they were going to be subjective experiences. Mm-hmm. So why shouldn't I tell them in that way? The fact that I brought my journalistic training as far as interviewing people and everything else, that sort of fit in, but I kept myself as a character, and I didn't really think about it in terms of what it meant for the journalism of it. It's only later that I've had to sort of really think about it and realize, well, this ends up signaling something. Well, it signals a certain subjectivity, obviously. And it definitely, the reader's going to look at this through my eyes. And I think what it allows you to do is admit your prejudices, which I think sometimes the reader might want to know. Mm-hmm. And the other thing it does is it allows you to highlight stories that are probably the best stories you get, that journalists often leave out of their stories. The personal stories that have to do with, you're from one culture and someone else is from another culture, and now how do you sort of negotiate that? Mm-hmm. That's happening all the time when you're working in those situations. And they're often the most interesting situations. They're often when you get to understand what people are thinking. Mm-hmm. And you see them as people with humor and people who are inviting you in. You see their hospitality. I don't want to cut that out. I think that's part of being somewhere. Mm-hmm. That's part of introducing the reader, as I was introduced, to those people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It also gives you an opening in a way to talk about aspects of daily life, and of course much of Footnotes in Gaza is about what was going on in Gaza and in the years you were there as opposed to 1956, and of course shows the connections between the two. But that whole piece on the feast, the holiday, and the slaughter.
Oh, right.
Which is a little bit of shifting of gears, but it's a very rich evocation of daily life, of people focusing on the slaughter of the animal and consuming it and
what
the whole
it means.
Culture around it.
Right. I found that was actually the most fun to draw, because for once I was sort of stepping out of the whole military aspect of the situation, and I felt like an anthropologist in a way, and I thought, boy, that'd be a great way a cartoonist could probably be good at anthropology, or that's something the medium could get into, I think.
Well, maybe we'll hear from any anthropologists in the audience if that's a way to go.
Yeah.
Well, the objectivity question comes up, and I know, anyone who deals with the question of Palestine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, gets flack about this.
Well, let me ask you about that. Because you're in an academic setting, and I always wonder how you deal with that, because your positions are known, you have lectures, you have students who might not agree with you. How do you deal with all that?
Well, there are many things to be said about it. The kind of thing that goes on in the classroom is one thing, and I think all of us do our best. We may not always succeed, but do our best to encourage open discussion about this. I always start out courses or classes that deal with the Palestine issue by saying everybody's entitled to opinion. That's fine. We want everybody to be able to speak up. But you also, if you're going to speak up, I mean, you have to be respectful of other people's opinion. We have to have a sort of rational, respectful discussion. And B, it's not enough to say, well, I really feel this, and that's enough, right? You have to be able to make an argument based on something, so that it's not just, I feel that Israel is right, I feel whatever, right? That we're talking as scholars would do in a scholarly setting, and you have to have arguments based on some analysis of the historical record. So that's in the classroom. I think the real problem arises outside the classroom, right, in the wider community, given that I think for a lot of people in the United States and for much of the media until relatively recently, Palestinians were terrorists, and there has been such a strong identification with Israel and sympathy towards Israel. It's been very difficult to lay out a more complex critical view. And there are well-established, shall we say, organizations and bodies of people with access to the media who've made it their job in life to go after people who they feel say the wrong things. So all of us, academics and non-academics, who've encouraged a more critical view, and of course this bears on U.S. government policy as well with regard to this conflict, have gotten flack, have gotten harassment. There have been instances where there have been efforts made by outside groups to deny people tenure or stop people from getting hired and so on.
Has that happened to you?
Sure, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Well, and it's happened to lots of people I know. I'm sure that over the course of the early years of my career, long before I came to NYU, which has been a very happy place, when I would apply for a job, there are gatekeepers, right? If you're applying for a job and there's somebody in that department who doesn't like your politics, and word gets around, and there are ways of getting the word around, then who wants to have a fight with their colleagues, right? And if somebody says, over my dead body, will you hire this person? It's not worth having a fight. So this kinds of things happens, and through a variety of mechanisms. Now, I should say in some ways it's gotten better, I think, than it was 20 or, I hate to say this, 30 years ago when I started. Not quite 30 years ago, thankfully. Started teaching. So I think there's much more understanding of the complexities of this issue and a much richer and more useful understanding. So the power of the gatekeepers is less effective within universities. And it's been possible for lots of people who have, again, critical views to get jobs teaching. And then that creates a critical mass. But it is true in the field of Middle Eastern studies, and it's not just about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's about other things as well, that there have been organized efforts, certainly after September 11th, using the web to intimidate scholars into silence, to not voice their critical views about American policy, about the Bush administration's response to September 11th, about the war in Iraq, and so on, as well as Israeli policy and various other things, to try to silence them, to give them the sense that they are being watched, and anything they said in the classroom outside of it could and would be used against them. So I think that's dissipated a little bit. It's not quite as bad, but we've had incidents up at Columbia, you may be aware of, where people were attacked by organized groups outside the campus and came up with tenure issues and a range of things. So this is a very hot question, and generally the accusation is that somebody's not being objective. Now in your work, you're clearly taking the side of the victims, right? You're clearly standing with the dispossessed, the
Yes,
murdered, the threatened.
Yes.
And I know in some of the reviews, people have raised this question: where's the Israeli side of things, right? Where's the Israeli perspective? And which I'm not saying is your job to be representing, and in fact you do include it, or try to include it, or try to look at that side. And I think at some point you gave a talk with the title, I may have gotten this wrong, Who the Hell Cares About Objectivity? If I got it, if I have it wrong, I apologize.
Whenever I talk, objectivity is an interesting word because depending on how you define it, when I talk about objectivity, I'm talking about the objectivity of the journalism school and the objectivity that the American press sort of thinks is its domain and its great gift to its readers, which I find somewhat ludicrous. And again, I'll have to go back to my own experience, because at that moment when I thought, wow, I didn't know anything about this issue, except I had this notion that a whole people were just terrorists. That's when I began to think. I really began to question the idea of the way American journalism presents this sort of issue, and that's when that idea of objectivity began to sort of quiver and quake a bit for me. For myself, I mean, over time, what I definitely did begin to feel that, Palestinians had been historically wronged. It's not that I didn't understand Zionist imperatives, actually. I mean, clearly when you read European history, the pogroms and the Holocaust, you begin to understand some motivation for Zionism. That's pretty clear. But when you look at what happened, it seemed, yes, a people was dispossessed, which seemed wrong. I sort of took it from the viewpoint that, especially when I started out, I didn't hear that many Palestinian voices in the media. I think it has changed to some extent. And I thought, I'm going to go and see how the occupation and how the Palestinians, how they live. And at that point, I decided I wouldn't look at the Palestinians as victim with a capital V either, because it's not as simple as that. And I think, as much as I would say my viewpoint is subjective and sympathetic to the Palestinians, what I really promised myself I would never do is sugarcoat anything I heard. Because I think what I really strive for isn't really this notion of objectivity, which to me, the way the American journalism puts it, it almost feels like a tennis match. It's like tennis match journalism. It's, okay, this side says this side says that, then this side says this, and this side says that. And you're just like following a ball around, and the journalist feels they've done their job just by presenting both sides of the issue. Well, I think it's up to the journalist to get closer to the truth, and honesty is the word that I'm looking for. I'm going to see the Palestinians. That's clear. I'm going to sort of see what their lives are like. Now, sometimes I'm going to hear things that they're saying that is not going to wash well with the Western audience. It doesn't wash well with me. So I know it's not going to look good, but that's what I'm hearing, so that's what I'm going to report. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I feel, in the larger scheme of things, I feel that you hear a lot of the Israeli perspective. I think it's pretty understood, and it's the dominant perspective when you listen to politicians or most of the mainstream media. So I feel I'm doing a service, really, by presenting something of the other side. I mean, do we want to get to know these people or not? So that's how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense to me. Similar things go on, I think, in the academic world. In recent years, there's been a lot of criticism, especially in the study of the Middle East and work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about an alleged lack of balance and diversity in views, which I think is parallel to what you talk about, the notion in journalism that the truth is sort of right in the middle. There are two sides, and the job of a journalist is to present both sides without any effort to look at who's right in this, right, to delve into it further, right? That's how the Bush administration got away with invading Iraq, right?
Right. Because then the dominant perspective is always going to be that side which is better at talking. And that isn't where the truth necessarily is.
Absolutely. I mean, when people start raising questions about balance and diversity, I ask, well, that's fine. Should we teach the Nazi point of view on the Jewish question to balance some other point of view? Should we teach creationism alongside evolution by natural selection? I mean, one can multiply examples. The truth isn't there in the middle. It needs to be excavated. It's not easy to find necessarily, but it's not dead in the middle between two divergent viewpoints, which are themselves arbitrary. So these kinds of issues certainly come up a great deal.